Hi, I'm Andrea Reichert. I'm curator at the Manitoba Crafts Museum and Library. Welcome to the first Safe at Home program that we're hosting both from the museum, our museum, the Manitoba Crafts Museum and Library, and the Seven Oaks House Museum. We have 4 programs planned through March every Thursday evening, and on different topics. We'd like to thank the provincial government who's funded this through the Safe at Home program. And so the evening is going to include 3 different components. One is a component where I'm going to showcase items from our collection here. Another component is going to be where we have a guest. Jane Daly is here. She's a conservator. She's going to be talking about how you can care for some items in your home. And the third component is from the Seven Oaks House Museum. So Eric, you've got to come and tell us a little bit about that.
All right. Can we see me over here? All right. Hey, everybody. For those of you who don't recognize me, I guess especially with the mask on, right? My name is Eric. I'm the curator at Seven Oaks House Museum. As Andrea said, we're super excited to partner on this really unique for us program. You know, we did a lot of these live tours last summer, but it's really exciting to like branch out, right? Take the show on the road. We're going to look at Andrea's collection. We have our expert, Jane Daly, who's hiding off camera. She's a truly tremendously experienced conservator, and she's going to share with us some of the best kind of like tips and tricks and hacks for what you can do to protect your own precious objects at home. We've all got those photos, those scrapbook albums, these kind of strange objects sometimes that we're not sure what to do with. But you know, there's still sort of like museum practices we can employ at home, right? So really excited. We're going to kick things off with Andrea. Then we're going to end the program with a little pre-recorded video, a tour behind the scenes at Seven Oaks House, which is really, really special. Nobody gets to go in there in the winter. Nobody gets to see what's going on except for us. Now, with that being said, this is our first time doing this, so there might be some technical difficulties with the pre-recorded segment. I just wanted to give you a heads up. If things don't go smoothly, I'm going to post the video on our page afterwards. So you'll be able to see the tour just as a separate video. And you should get a notification about that too when the premiere goes up, if it's necessary. So that's all I have to say for now. I'm going to leave you to the experts.
So this first evening focuses on documentary items. So that includes things like photographs and scrapbooks, but also things that physical objects that you might not necessarily think are documentary, but really are. So I'm going to take my mask off because Jane and Eric are now far enough away, and it'll be a little more comfortable for everybody if we do that. I have selected a few photographs, not very many, because there are some that are going to be in Eric's presentation and also in Jane's presentation. So this is just one photograph we have in our museum collection. And the interesting thing about this is it's a red cooker, and you can see she's sitting outside. And what makes this wonderful for our collection is that this piece here, I don't know how well you can see it, but it's a ship scene. Anyways, that was donated with it. So we have a documentary artifact or a documentary photograph of a piece that's in the museum collection. And there's also a framed photograph of, just doing some technical bits here.
Our camera rotated on us. This is the danger of using a smartphone. It thinks it knows what you want.
So this is a framed photograph of Mary Mcleod, who was involved with the Crafts Guild many years ago. And this item was hanging in the library here at the museum in our previous location. I also brought out some samplers from the museum collection. And you might not necessarily think that samplers are documentary, but when you look at them, they almost always have the name. Let me just see the name, Abigail Jackson. She went to boarding school. And this particular piece is from 1808. And so all wonderful little stitches. Most of it's just the alphabet, but there are some floral motifs as well. And so if you have these types of items in your collection or in your home collection, it documents the ages and sometimes the schooling of the person who made them. Here's another one. So this one is from 1831, so a little bit later. And this is Mary Fisher, aged 8, believe it or not. So it's it's got the same kind of stitching on it as well. And this one here is from 1881. And I'm trying to figure out the best way to show it. I'm wondering if this is actually the best way to show it.
Yeah, you can bring it up to the camera.
Okay, all right.
I should add too, if anybody has questions or you want to see something a little bit closer, just let us know. I got my eye on the chat and I will do my best to take care of everybody.
So we've had this one for quite some time in the museum collection, and we have an exhibit right now. It's actually an exhibit of samplers. So I was doing some research on samplers, and one thing that I found, there's a book here called Samplers, How to Compare and Value, and look at what is in this book. I don't know, can you see that?
That looks exactly the same pattern.
It is exactly the same. So this was obviously made from a printed design, and then the stitcher was just changing the name. So the name part in this funny shape in the bottom is different, obviously, and the verse that is on there, which is hard to see at this point, but the verse is different on the one that's in the book. And so I just found that amazing. I was flipping through looking for information, researching samplers in general, and I came across this and I thought, I've seen that before in my collection. I also brought out a whole bunch of scrapbooks. I think a lot of people have scrapbooks of various kinds in their home collections. People have kept them, sometimes they're photo albums, sometimes they're newspaper clippings. We have a bunch of really different kinds of ones. This is honestly my favorite. I'm going to put it under the camera here. It's probably hard for you to read, but this is a linen sample. I wasn't wearing gloves before because I wasn't actually touching the pieces with my bare hands.
It doesn't look official if you don't have your white gloves on.
No, it doesn't. You know, you gotta have the gloves. So these are linen samples, and this one was the flax was grown. This one was grown in 1942 at Fort Garry, and it gives the name of the person who grew it and the person who wove it. And every page is a different sample. So this one is also from Fort Garry in Manitoba. They're all slightly different. This one is in Fort Garry, but this one is from Nora, Saskatchewan. And this one's also from Nora, Saskatchewan. This is from Big River, Saskatchewan. I'm not going to look at every page, but there are some from Alberta as well. There's Athabasca, Alberta. So we don't really know who put this together or why. I suspect it was a challenge of some kind where different communities would grow the flax and different weavers would weave it, and then they put it together in one book. And so it's a pretty interesting document, documenting both the agricultural side of things, but also how the products were used in real life. We have a couple of more standard kind of scrapbooks. This one, a lot of our scrapbooks, not surprisingly, have fabric samples in them as well. But these ones have newspaper clippings and little bits of paper. There's all sorts of adhesive used in these. Sometimes it's glue, sometimes it's tape, sometimes it's staples. You can see here, there's these little reinforcements. Sometimes in ours, they're sewn on. So these, you never know what's going to happen on the different pages. There's all sorts of different samples on there. Sometimes they're weaving. Often in ours, they have the information on how you make that particular weave of fabric. This one is probably a pretty standard scrapbook format that people have in their homes. And this one here has little clippings. There's the names of all the women who put it together. And then it's just little scraps that were cut out of magazines and newspapers and all put together.
So Andrea, in a sense, these almost become like a community project, right? It's like a picture of those women in the community at a certain time. I
think these ones are, you know, often scrapbooks are much more family oriented, but these ones do tend to be a little bit more community oriented. A lot of ours came from the Crafts Guild of Manitoba. And so there was many groups within the guild that did different projects, or they were all weavers or they were all knitters, and they sort of did things together.
Okay. So were these kind of like the weaving sample one where it was all these different comparative kind of styles? Was that something that was common for people to do, to have a sample book like that?
I think it was. It allowed you to share the patterns. you could make something and cut it into little swatches, and sometimes you would send it was called a weaving draft, is what the name of what it is when you have the pattern for weaving. And so you could send a little swatch of the fabric and the weaving draft, and then someone else could follow the pattern essentially if they really liked it. And so I think that was a way to share information about the craft and about the weaving in particular.
Oh, it's interesting, right? We have geez, I'm gonna, I think, embarrass myself here, but what is it, Ravelry, where everybody shares their knitting patterns, right? This is like the early 20th century version.
It's kind of, yeah, it's got a similar thing. This is another scrapbook, and I just loved the, it's hard for you to see, but what it says is Achievement Day, February 28th, 1957, and just a cutout, and it's just so much from the time period. International Women's Day is just around the corner, and when you compare what achievement for women now is compared to this kind of thing, it's pretty telling. This one here has really basic sewing skills in it. It's the sewing club, and so there's little, here's all of her measurements and stuff like that. I don't know if you can see that. And then she's done samples of different types of seams. So here's a plain seam, and here's a lap seam, and there's a felled seam and a French seam. So all the different types of sewing seams that she would need to make clothing. And so she's attached these into a book. These ones are stapled in for the most part, although there's always some loose bits as well. So it's from the time. This one here was donated just a couple of years ago, and it's also a sample book, and it's got all these little odd bits of knitting in them, and they're haphazardly stuck on. Some of them, as you can see, are not. They're all just sewn on, and so the knitting itself isn't all that amazing. It's this funny little pile of bits in this book, but what makes this book interesting is that it's from Poland. It was Poland then, now it's Ukraine. And this booklet was made by a young woman who came to Canada in 1939 just as ships were stopping bringing Jewish people from Europe. And so she was actually from there, she was Jewish, and this was one of the things that she brought with her. So it's a different type of documentary piece. We also have a blouse from her in the collection. And so that's not the type of thing that a lot of people were able to bring with them when they were escaping Europe in 1939.
Well, it kind of says something to you, I think, well, to me at least, about how much she valued that knitting, right? And that craft. She didn't want to lose that knowledge and the way to, you know, my Polish isn't great, but it kind of looked like it's sort of like samples of Polish styles or something like that, right? She wanted to take it with her. This
stuff at the front is actually very school-based.
Okay.
I used Google Translate today.
Uh-huh.
And this says it's something like distribution of in Poland, and so this is how many Polish people. Like it's sort of a area exercise, right? So this is how many Polish people there are. This is how many Russians. This is Jewish, and this is German.
Oh, weird.
So she was actually doing, so it was in school, I guess, where the teacher was asking, you know, break down the population by ethnicity. And then represent that as a square. So it's still a kind of activity that happens in schools today. The context behind it might change, but just sort of taking numbers and working with them in different ways is an important skill.
That's really interesting to see those two put together like that. That's cool history on that book.
Yeah. I've got two more pieces. This here is, it's got this really utilitarian binder, contemporary binder. This is a much more recent piece. This is from the 1970s. And what this contains is samples of dyeing. The woman who made this, Margaret Ferguson, was a fiber dyer. And so she did all sorts of different tests with plants, natural plants. So you can see here, these ones here in the middle are blueberries from 1961, tea, beetroot, acorns. And so she has kept all these little, maybe I'm just gonna move this so you can see the colors better. she has kept all these little bits of yarn with what the colors are that they make. So there's oak bark, dried poplar leaves. There probably are different colors because she would use a different mordant or dye them more than once. If you put it in the dye bath one time, you get a different color than if you take it and then you put it back in a second time. So this was her way to document what she was doing and be able to remember what all the colors were. So these are one way that she's documented them on these little cards. But then the other are all these little plastic, these are slide sleeves. And so she stuck these little bits of fiber in with pieces of paper. And there's little codes on them, ALCU, I think that's probably a copper mordant, maybe an aluminum mordant, or alum rather. And so there's all these little bits, and then there's notes here about what she's done. There's even this one here is a little piece of the plant in there.
Cool.
So
it looks like flowers, like
yeah,
or
it's little flowers. So there's a wide variety of colors that you can get, and so this was her way of remembering what she had done, and in hopes of reproducing to some degree. Although I know with fabric dyeing, you can write down that you used 2 cups of acorns and you had this much alum and you left it in for this long and you'll get 2 different colors. But it's still a document of the range of colors, and these are all or mostly natural plants that you can find in Manitoba or northwestern Ontario. I think she had a cottage in the Kenora area. So so these are the types of things that you can still do today and find the materials and do your own fabric dyeing.
It's incredible, some of the vivid colors, right? Like there's bright purples, there's bright yellows, things that you'd think you need chemical dyes for.
Yeah.
Before you move on, Andrea, you mentioned this idea of using different mordants a couple of times. So what is a mordant?
Mordant is when you're doing fabric dyeing, let's say you're doing fabric dyeing with goldenrod leaves or petals, it'll give you a yellow color. But if you put copper in it, it changes the chemical. I'm not a dyer, so this is going to be really basic, but it changes the chemical property of the water, of the dye bath, so that it changes the color that you get. And sometimes it makes the colors brighter, and sometimes the mordant will make the colors duller, and sometimes it just makes them more color fast. So people have experimented for a long time about putting copper is a good one, but also iron. So you just put iron nails in. That's what they did a long time ago. Now it's a little bit more fancy. There's like special powders and stuff that give you more control over it. But that's what a mordant is.
Oh,
and so it changes the color. Like it'll still be in the same color family usually, but you might get a really bright yellow, and then you might get more of like a mustard yellow, or you might get a yellow that's really sort of a brownish kind of color. And it just depends on what you put into the dye bath.
Interesting. Oh, that's cool. It's chemistry, right? It's funny that the other ones were like school lesson books, because you can also really get into the chemistry if you wanted to.
Yeah, fabric dyeing is very chemistry based because it's all about how the materials react. And I've seen, we don't have one here, but I've seen dye samples where if you do it on cotton, you get a different kind of color than if you do it on linen or if you do it on wool. Because the fiber is different, so it absorbs the color differently. And so people who do dyeing will take all these samples and so that they can remember what they did and what they got, and in hopes of maybe replicating, and when you're doing experimenting, then you want to know, how did you get this color, right? So that you remember it, because after a while you don't remember, did I put this in or did I put that in? And so I have one more piece before we move on to the next section. So this is actually a little recipe book. So this one is from 1830.
Wow.
And it's very fragile.
It's almost 200 years old.
Yeah, it is. So this one has recipes. This is ginger cordial. I'm trying to read script upside down. It looks like a cool.
It's nice handwriting.
This is for napkin cheese. I'm not quite sure what napkin cheese is. It's probably something where you put the cheese in a cloth and then it soaks, or the liquid comes out and it's sort of like a cheesecloth kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But there's some in here there's one in here for washing lace. I'm not sure if I can find it upside down. Blackcurrant lozenges, There's one for cake, just general cake. Can't find the one for washing the fabric. There it is, to wash fine lace. That's it right there. So this is just a paper document, but it's quite old, and the paper is quite old. And I can imagine that this is similar to the things that might be in people's homes, because recipe books are treasured and sometimes protected documents where you're not necessarily sharing with anybody because it's your family recipes. And so that's what I brought out. That's documentary artifacts and documentary documents from the Manitoba Crafts Museum and Library collection. Some are true documents like photographs, but some are more like artifacts, physical things, but have a lot of documentary value.
Very nice, Andrea. Thank you for walking us through that. Those are some actually really cool pieces. I'm kind of jealous of the recipe book. I feel like that belongs at Seven Oaks House with our 1830s kitchen,
It's
you know.
staying here, Eric, I'm afraid.
Well, you know, with that, I think we're going to move on to Jane Daly's presentation. We're going to get into our sort of conservation side, where we talk a little bit about not just why these objects are interesting, but what you can do about your special artifacts of your own.
We just have a quick scene change here. I'm just going to move the table over to where Jane is. So, and Eric is going to move the camera so that everyone can see Jane as well.
All right, and we're back.
We're back. Hello, everybody. Nice introduction. I'm Jane Daly. As already indicated, I'm a conservator, specialize in archival records and also in preventive conservation for collections. I work with the Museums Association a lot. So I'm here, and it's only 15 minutes to do a whole whirlwind tour. So I think we'll have questions at the end, but you noticed I've got gloves on. These are my nitrile gloves. I prefer them over cotton. I find them a little more grippy, particularly if I'm handling glass or smooth surfaces. Of course, there's always the cotton, but one thing I advise you against, if you ever see these gloves with the little dots on them, avoid them because they can actually mark metals and glass. So that's my first tip. Care of collections is mostly common sense. If you wouldn't do it to a person, you wouldn't do it to an artifact. Let me show you some of the things that I've come across that aren't good for your home treasure. For storing things, you may have come across, well, acidic card is one thing. You can see that it's pretty nasty and brown, and it breaks very easily. So you may have heard the term acid-free. It doesn't actually mean much by itself. What it should mean, if it's qualified, is that the materials are made of good quality fibers, usually not containing lignin, which is what you get when you use trees to make paper. Paper was not made from trees originally. It was made from linen or cotton. So people store things in ways that aren't very good. And I'll show you another piece here. Past the fun, stuck to an envelope that somebody has trodden on. So this is the kind of thing you want to avoid for your home archives. I find some other really disgusting things. I seem to have a lot of disgusting things, but cheap plastics. Plastics that stick to things, they're usually very soft. Plastic bags are a good example because they have plasticizers to make them soft. Otherwise they'd be stiff and you couldn't use them as a bag. So regular plastic, oh, I'm sure everyone's got one of these in their homes. It's one of those magnetic photo sleeves. My mother had a ton of these. You put the photo in, you lift the plastic sheet back, put the photo in, it sticks to the glue at the back, put the sheet back over it. You'll never get the photo out if it sets. So that's not a good thing.
That's an interesting one for me, Jane, because I think people often think of plastic as being like a very safe sort of thing. You know, it's clear, it seems like it would be stable, but I think over time, often plastic is the scariest, right? It turns into these turns like back into oil and all these crazy chemicals,
It
right?
does, you're exactly right. It deteriorates, it breaks down. It's not the quality of the fibers so much as the additives and the plasticizers that are put in. In order for plastic to be soft, it has to have plasticizers. And unfortunately, they're often cheap and nasty.
Oh yeah.
Now, I have here some samples of tape. Tape is something you'll often see on documents. The older tape will fall off and it'll leave this brown stain. The newer tape, it's an acrylic base and it has a good side and a bad side. The good side is it never truly sets. The bad side is it never truly sets. So it's always sticky. These are actually samples of water tape because originally tape was invented to hold music sheets together as you were playing on piano, and it actually comes off with water. It's wonderful when I discover this on a document and I don't have to use horrible horrible solvents to remove things.
Tape is a bad one.
Tape, evil. So if you do have plastics, you can buy good quality plastic sleeves for your photos. This is a very nice little toned photograph. It's a carte de visite, I think. It's on a sleeve. It is in a sleeve. Now you can buy these. It's difficult to get things locally. There are companies like Printfile that actually now have a very extensive website. But when you go into a store and you're looking for something, oh, by the way, this is another wonderful example. I just have to show you plastics. That was once clear plastic.
Wow.
It's a driver's license sleeve. It's very cheap. And the ink from the paper has offset onto the plastic. And this can happen with your documents if you use a cheap plastic for storing your documents. So avoid the cheap plastic. Printfile, as I said, is one brand. I went to Staples the other day. I was looking for what is available locally. And here's one thing. And now when you look at this and you see it says, what does it say? Reading upside down, acid-free, archival safe. And you think, oh, great, I'll get that. Don't. Acid-free means what? Exactly. Acidity in a plastic is very rare. It's not a paper. And you can't do a pH test on a plastic. So it means absolutely nothing. Archival safe, what? Safe for what? There are certain standards in conservation and preservation like the photoactivity test. So if it says it passes the PAT, you know you're good. So this one I'm suspect of, but this one.
Oh, so Jane, sorry to interrupt you. I'm hearing people are having a little bit of a hard time hearing you. I don't know if you want to, you can take the mask off. Yeah, okay. We're safe over here.
I just feel a little naked without the mask. Is that better?
Yes, that'll be better for sure.
Thank you, thank you. This one actually says on it PVC free. And that is one of the biggest problems with plastics is the polyvinyl chloride, the softener, the plasticizer. So this is made without PVC. This I actually took home and did a Beilstein test on with a flame to see if there was any PVC in it, and it seems safe. So it's sort of buyer beware, but there are companies, actually Uline now makes, or sells rather, a variety of products that have passed the photographic activity test. So I'm kind of keen on Uline at the moment. Anybody know what this is? This is what's left of rubber bands after about 30 years.
Oh, wow.
These little brown things. That's why you never put rubber bands around things, elastics, because the rubber is unstable, it breaks down, it often sticks to the documents or whatever, and you can't get it off. So evil things. What do we have in the way of good things? This is a book that's damaged by mice, so I keep it in a Ziploc bag. Food grade polyethylene is okay for storage. It's just you may get a buildup of humidity in there. So I don't use it for storage, but for something like of organic material, like paper usually, but for metals or ceramics or anything that's not organic in the sense that it's not made of something that was once living. This is in a bag because it's a health hazard. You can see, I think, the wonderful chew marks on it. And mice have terrible habits. They urinate every 3 minutes and poop every 5 or something like that. So if you have anything that's been chewed by a mouse, you're almost certain to have nasty stuff on it, whether you know it or not. So What else have we got? Books. It's fairly easy to make simple book boxes. This is one that it's a book that it's the first book I ever bound when I think I was 18, 19. This is just a drop back box, which looks kind of hard to make. It is not hard. And I do actually, through the AMM, teach a workshop in box making. But there's something even simpler. But wait. So where's my other book? Even just to protect your book by putting a paper cover on it, it just protects it from scuffing. This is just a little book, very badly treated, that I put a paper wrap around on. This is micro chamber paper. If you're going to buy supplies like paper, go to an art store and get really good quality art paper or one-ply mat board. You can order the other stuff, but it means usually if you're ordering the true acid-free, the PAT qualified materials, you have to go out of town to Toronto or to the States. So instead of doing that, if you buy really good quality art supplies, boards and papers, you should be okay. So that's one. And then this is another card. You could use a one-ply mat board for this. This is a book box that is made completely without adhesives. It's entirely wraparound. And I will take it apart and show you. Of course, now I have to be able to get the book out. So here's the book inside. These are 2 strips of acid-free card, true acid-free card. One is folded around, and I've also nipped the corners off. And then I've placed it down like that. And then this is just folded around and tucked underneath. And everything's kept in place. This is really simple to make. Of course, now I can't get it back together because everyone's looking at me. This is a really easy technique that anybody can do.
So Jane, if people wanted to make something like that, can they find the instructions online or can they ask us about it? Is there any way we can kind of help them with that?
Probably ask us, or also most of the major institutions in Winnipeg, the museums and the archives, do take public inquiries on how to do things. I don't know if this is online. It's just something that I worked out myself over the years.
Oh yeah. Well, we don't want to steal your secrets, but if people have questions, they can always leave us a message and we can try to help after the show too.
And they can contact me also through the Association of Manitoba Museums. I do the outreach program there, so I handle the inquiries and a short plug. Great institution to join for $25 a year.
Yes, everybody, if you're watching this, you probably should support the AMM. That's true.
Let me see if I can find another book. This isn't, oh yes, this is the one. If you get a nice big sheet of paper, it's possible just to make a simple wraparound. Again, no adhesives. And of course, now I'm doing it in front of the camera. It's just not working. But this is a big square of paper, and it is a true square. And it's twice the length of the book. So I think the book's about 6 inches, so it's 12 inches. And you just do a very fancy little wrap around it with folds.
Oh.
And then you can fold it back in. This is a bit too long. I was in a hurry to make this just before I came. But the idea is that it just folds under the little tuck. And then I should put this under the camera so you can actually see it. So then it just tucks in like that. And it's just simple to do.
That's a really cool example for me because it's super accessible, right? It's not complicated. It's just like wrapping a present, except you don't use any tape, right? As long as you're thinking about those materials and what they might do in the long run, you don't have to be fancy. You don't have to go to the museum supply store.
Yeah, it's common sense often, and the more you know about preservation, the more you realize it is common sense. What else can I show you? I have so much. These are just samples of the sleeves that you can buy online in places like I showed the brochure earlier for the company whose name I'm just too nervous to remember. Sorry.
It's okay. People can actually rewind the video if they need to. So
Yes. Photo.
Oh, James, I got a question for you. So how should people store books and papers so that they don't get musty?
Oh, that is a good question because paper is organic and it absorbs odors. And it is a little difficult to get them out. Generally not in a basement, not usually in an attic. A lot of attics in homes are unheated, so you don't have a very stable environment. But basements are the worst, particularly if you put it on the floor. It'll just get contact mold from the cement if it's an unfinished cement floor.
Okay.
So yeah, avoid that. And if you get a musty smell, you can take a baking pan with a grill, like a grill pan, and underneath the grill pan part, the lid you lift off, put cat litter, and then put the grill pan back, and then some paper, and put your book on top, and then pop it all in a Ziploc bag. And the cat litter will help absorb the odor.
Interesting.
Yes.
That's one of those sort of, I hate this term, but that's one of those hacks, right?
Yes.
You wouldn't think that you go to a museum, a professional conservator, you put it in a bag with cat litter. It doesn't have to be complicated sometimes.
No. Well, I do go up one myself on that. I actually buy aquarium filter, a charcoal. Carbon. And they come in little sachets, and I put those in the bottom because I don't have a cat. So the activated charcoal that's used in aquarium filters will also work well. And I get it in the bag because otherwise it's very messy.
Right.
You don't want to get it on your hands or on your artifacts. So yeah, there's all kinds of things you can, ways of doing things. These are little corners. Somebody gave me this bag. These are in the category of don't use these. Just nasty little paper corners. They look quite nice, but they're cheap, nasty paper. You can buy, and I did have a pack, and I unfortunately don't have it at hand. You can buy little clear Mylar, good quality plastic corners that you can just stick on the page instead.
Oh yeah.
And keep your photos in that way.
So I do have one more question for you, Jane, and then we should probably start to wind down a little bit. If people are looking for, just plain paper to do a wrap like that, what do they need to look for to make sure that it's safe, that it's actually, archival, etc., but really appropriate?
Okay, quick segue into paper. Paper is made traditionally from linen hemp, not trees. Trees are very cheap. Around 1830, a machine was developed to make paper out of wood pulp. That made mass printing possible. Changed a lot of people could afford books. And that paper is nasty. It breaks down. I have a piece here. I'm just going to step off to the side. This is a free press from 1911. And you can see the condition that it is in. It is nasty.
Oh yeah.
It's dirty and it's yellowed. I think it may have come out of the wall of a house. That's what cheap paper does. So you want to avoid paper that contains lignin or is made from wood. And art paper is often made from cotton. So if you go to the art stores and ask for good quality linen or cotton paper of a certain weight, get a thin one, you can use that. So you may pay a little bit more, but you won't have long-term problems with it.
Interesting.
So I have one interesting box. Do I have time or?
Yeah, let's do one more. Absolutely.
Oh, I also have the silver. A lot of people polish silver with things that take the surface off the silver. So I have it all here set up, and I'll see if I can fit it under there.
Oh yeah, that's perfect.
There's a silver cloth. Haggerty's is a brand that's very soft, but I also make up my own using high quality calcium carbonate into a slurry. And this is one of my workshop pieces. This has been cleaned in places with the calcium carbonate by people practicing, and it's worked out very well in the areas you can see. It's plate, so it's stained because in some places the plate's being worn off. And a way of doing this that's really cool is you get a tube sock and you can use it as a glove so that when you're polishing with your whole hand. So that's one thing I never answer the door when I'm polishing silver. Or you can buy a cloth.
Raise a few questions, right?
Wearing gloves again. I chew my nails. Oh, I have some more more things here because once I get going, it's hard to stop. This is a photo, and I don't know if you can see on this photo, but somebody has written on it with ink just there, "We are here," or whatever. Bad, because the ink will just stain permanently. And if you write in ink on the back, it will also come through to the front and disfigure the photograph. So a soft 5B pencil is the best thing to write on the back of a photo. This is a Polaroid. It was a Polaroid. It's starting to look pretty spooky right now. I don't know what it is or even what way up it goes. I've just got a little Mylar sleeve. They're unfixed photos and they're not permanent. Something like this, scan it so that you have a copy and then just accept that the original is come together. And then I have a box. It was a slow day in the studio. So my sister and I started playing around with Coroplast. And we just made a little box with the wooden edging you get at the lumber store, at Home Hardware, wherever, and used nails and glue to hold it together. We thought, wouldn't it be fun to make these? But we never got around to it. But anybody that likes working with their hands could easily do this. And the Coroplast you get at the hardware store, it's usually clear, which is perfect. Coroplast is a reasonably acceptable material. The only thing is, if it's exposed to a lot of, I think it's fluorescent light, it can break down. I have some samples of it turning to powder. So do I have any more time or should we call it a day?
I think that's probably about all we can squeeze in for now, Jane. Thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise with us. That's awesome.
It's been a blast. Thanks for letting me speak.
Yeah, no, anytime. Now, Andrea, I think you had something else you wanted to show?
Yeah, I'm just going to switch places with Jane for a second, and then I have one thing to show that's conservation related. We were talking about enclosures, and just leave that Jane.
Yield the floor. I'll take out 2 socks and leave.
So Jane was talking about paper and wrapping in paper, and then talking about how the best paper to get is paper that is fiber-based. And the other thing you can do is you can wrap your items in fabric. And so that's what we do here. This is a muslin bag that we've made. It's for this lovely piece with the lovely lady on it. And in our storage, we just slide it right in here. And then it's got a little fold down top. And then there's these ties. These ones are actually twill tape, but I'm just going to flip it over. But you can also use the selvages. And for our purpose, we have the accession number on it so that we know what's inside this bag. And so if you can't find fancy paper, you can also go to the fabric store and get cotton.
Nice.
And so this is muslin, but if you get 100% cotton, that's fine too. So so that's just sort of an aside. I was thinking as Jane was talking about paper, so I'm just going to flip that off again one more time. So that's all that we have tonight for the live portion. We're going to send you off to the taped portion that we did at the Seven Oaks Museum, and hope it plays nicely. And if it does, that's great. And if it doesn't, Eric's going to get it on Facebook at some point this evening, so you'll be able to watch it in its choppy format. So thanks so much for joining us. This has been fantastic. I hope you join us again. We have 3 more sessions. The next one is next Thursday, and we have Claire Sparling with us. We're going to be talking about historic clothing. The next week is on flat textiles, and the last week is on indigenous pieces like beadwork and the silk embroidery. So we've got lots of different diversity, and yeah, just I hope you enjoyed it, and come back again. So good night, everybody.
All right, thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. So as Andrea said, I'm gonna play our pre-recorded tour of Seven Oaks House, and I truly hope it works because it was really, really fun to do this. But you know, as she said, I promise if it's choppy, you don't have to leave comments. We will notice, and I promise that in the next hour or so, I'm going to upload the video to our page. So just check back in that time, and then we'll keep our fingers crossed that everything. I really hope it works because it was really, really fun to do this. But you know, as she said, I promise if it's choppy, you don't have to leave comments. We will notice, and I promise that in the next hour or so, I'm going to upload the video to our page. Hey folks, how's it going? My name's Eric. I'm the curator here at Seven Oaks House Museum. And we're really excited to be doing this project, the Safe at Home Museum, coming live to all you folks today. It's really awesome for us because the museum here is normally closed during the winter. Nobody gets to see this kind of thing, so it's a lot of fun to put on our coats, get our gloves on, and get to show you this stuff when most people wouldn't get to see it. So Seven Oaks House here is actually the oldest home in Winnipeg. These little buildings next to it are the oldest buildings of any kind in all of Winnipeg too. Very, very cool piece of history. So let's come on inside and I'll tell you a little bit about the family that lived here. So you can see right here the Inkster Sinclair family. They were both really prominent families here in early Manitoba. John Inkster here came from the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland. He immigrated back in the 1820s to settle here. And his wife, Mary Sinclair, she was of Orkney Scottish Métis ancestry. Her mother had Cree background. And they met here in northern Manitoba during the fur trade. And they became a really powerful kind of political and influential trade family during the fur trade. That's really how the family became known, and they had a big impact on the city's development here. I won't really get too much into all of their stories, but we're very fortunate in that we have artifacts, objects in this house, the house where they lived, that belong to the family. We still have them here in the museum, and so throughout our visits this month, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the stories as they relate to these people and relate to our home here. So without further ado, let's go check out the collection. So I'm going to take off my outdoor gloves and put on my curator's gloves here. Now, the Inksters, they were a very interesting family, and every family has their stories, right? Today we're talking kind of about family heirlooms, in a sense, and heirlooms can take a lot of forms, right? Many of us have photos, like I showed there, we might have letters or documents, but we also have these very different personal objects, and they all tell a really, really important part of our family's story. And it's important that we protect that history, The only reason we can talk about the Inksters today is because their family, their children valued these things and they valued their stories. And they took steps to preserve them, basically. So today we all get to enjoy this wonderful museum built way back in 1851. So it's a very, very cool place. Now, I'm going to start out with this guy here. This is the Inkster family's photo album. We'll get some close-ups added here, but this one is actually a picture of one of the Inkster's daughters, Ellen Inkster, that you saw out there. This is the original photo. And it's very unique. It's quite rare and very cool to have this album. It shows some of the Inkster family members, but it also shows other people that the Inksters knew. Some of them are very famous Manitobans. There's a guy named James Ross in here. The Ross family's house is also a museum over in Point Douglas. But James Ross is most famous for working with Louis Riel. He actually represented the English Métis community. He was one of the founding fathers of Manitoba. So we have these original photos that the Inksters saved that were given to them, but there's a problem. You might notice there are no captions, right? None of these photos, well, virtually none of these photos are identified. We don't know who these people are, even if they are historically significant. People didn't necessarily write on their photos. Many of us don't today because we just take for granted we know those people. But when these things become a historical document, that information can be lost forever, right? The other kind of sad thing is that from being stored in this album and from being displayed, some of them have faded, being exposed to light. You always want to keep your photos somewhere safe and dark. And they've also been damaged from being leafed through. So, they weren't really thinking about preservation. They were treating these as a normal object in a sense. But here, this letter is kind of another cool sort of historical document of a very different sort. It's a literal document, right? But this is a letter that was written by one of the Inkster's daughters to one of their other daughters. Her husband was a fur trader with the Hudson's Bay Company, and they had moved off at this time, I believe, to northern Saskatchewan, around the Île-la-Crosse area. Now, the letter itself is pretty interesting in terms of what it says. They're just kind of talking about their daily affairs, but you can sort of get from this that there was a fire in their house, actually, and that they blamed the maid for it. And we only have a part of the letter, so we don't get the whole story, but it's an interesting little snippet into their lives, and it's the kind of history that you would never find in like an official history book, right? This very personal kind of story. But beyond what the letter itself says, what's really interesting about it you might notice it looks kind of like scribbles, and that's because the text runs in two directions. It goes horizontally here like a normal letter, and it also runs vertically on the next side. It's signed here, Ellen Inkster. That's the woman whose photo I showed you. Now, this was actually something that was very commonly done in the 19th century. You can see it again here. Imagine getting this letter and trying to read this. It actually took us hours and hours of work to interpret this. The reason people did this was to save paper and to save on postage. It's hard to imagine this today, right? But at this time in the mid-19th century, paper was incredibly expensive. It had to actually be made by hand. It wasn't necessarily done here. A lot of it was shipped from places like the east coast of the US, New York, or all the way from London. Now, we'll see if we can get a better close-up of this, but the reason I'm holding this up to the light like this, there's actually a watermark. The paper is stamped 1865, and it has the manufacturer's name on it. This is how special paper was. It was actually signed by the manufacturer who made it, so that you knew it wasn't counterfeit. So people knew that paper was precious, and postage was done by weight. So if you added another page to your letter, it would cost twice as much to send it. If you could double your message by crisscrossing like that, then you could save in two ways. So it's actually very common, and it's a really, really cool thing now. You know, in this time where we're all on Facebook Live, right? We're broadcasting this on Zoom. It's hard to imagine saving that money on that piece of paper, right? By making your letter illegible. But even a family like the Inksters that were very wealthy did that kind of stuff. Now, I should probably introduce where we are too. I talked about the house a little bit, but this is a room that we call the parlor. The parlor is basically like the living room that we would have in our home today. This is the public area of the house. And it was usually the fanciest area of the house too. They have these beautiful, basically velvet chenille kind of curtains imported from France. Families would really show off their wealth in a place like this to impress visitors. Now, over here, we actually come, for me, to one of the most interesting stories that we have in the family. You know, photographs are an obvious memento, right? Many of us save those. Letters, another obvious one that we save. But over here, this jewelry is a very different kind of memento of family. All of this jewelry here is actually made completely out of human hair. It's really hard to believe, I know, and a lot of people find it kind of creepy. If you believe in ghosts in a museum, these are probably the most likely things to be possessed as far as an object goes, right? A piece of a person. But at that time, these were a really, really popular art form that was used to remember loved ones, basically. Up until the 1860s, you virtually could not get a photo here in Manitoba. Up until the late 19th century, only wealthy families like the Inksters could afford them, and you had to go to a studio, you had to pose. So you might have one or two pictures of your family, right? You wouldn't have snapshots on your phone like we do today. So people found other ways of remembering family. This little piece here, and I promise we will zoom in for a little close-up here, is a brooch. And it was a brooch that belonged to one of the Inkster women, Mary Inkster, the mother of the family here. And it contains a woman's hair. It's a little braid of dark hair that's been braided and put under the glass there, almost like a locket. Now, we don't know whose hair it is exactly, but we think it could have been her mother's, or certainly another very close family member that was related to her. Now, again, in this time before photos, you needed to remember family members, right? If you moved to another country, you would probably never see your family again. It took months on a boat to get back to England. You might not have that photo. Letters, again, incredibly expensive, so contact was limited and you had to treasure those people however you could. So this piece of hair was a way of keeping them with you. You know, it started off in the early 19th century with these brooches like this, but later people got sort of carried away and they started making extremely elaborate jewelry out of this. You can see this delicately woven and twisted braided kind of form in the bracelets, and also these really incredible open kind of mesh-like earrings. It's really impressive. And people mostly didn't do this stuff at home. There were actually professional hair workers that had workshops that would make it for you. There was a time you could even send your hair into Sears, actually, and they guaranteed on the ad, you will get your family's hair back. I guess there were, you know, unscrupulous people who were stealing hair or something like that. But the fear was there, and you actually mailed these things off, basically, to be made. Then, you know, they usually became treasured family heirlooms. This piece over here next to it, though, is sort of a different form of hair work. You can see it's this really elaborate wreath here. Now, again, this is 100% human hair, just attached with wires, basically. And so people would collect hair from the whole family. There's brown, there's black, there's blonde, there's gray, and those all came from a different person. They wouldn't have been dyed. You would have saved that hair up for months, maybe even for years to make a work like this, and then spend hundreds of hours weaving and twisting and bending it to make a wreath of this nature. And these would be shown off in the home, in the parlor like this. And again, it was basically like a family portrait. It's hard to think about, I realize, but in a time before photography, this was your family portrait. It represented grandma, it represented the children, and it was a beautiful object that lasted forever. Now we find them a little strange, but it's a really, really cool history, I think. Now I'm just going to kind of switch sides here to talk about my favorite story and the last one for today. So museums often have historical stories about people, right? We have houses dedicated to famous people, we remember them, we name buildings after them, but it's not so often that you have a museum celebrating the story of a famous dog. But luckily enough, that's actually what we have here. So this guy here is Bob's the dog. It's a funny name, maybe his tail kind of bobbed and wagged along as he walked, but that's what he was called. The Inksters lived with him. I don't like saying owned for pets, and it's obvious that they valued him, they really cared deeply about him and saw him as a member of the family. It's very, very neat and unusual to have this kind of a portrait. It shows how important Bob's was, and it shows how rich the Inksters were. That in a time when most people couldn't get photos of themselves, their families, the Inksters went to a studio and they had this posed portrait of Bob's looking regal on a bearskin rug, right? I think that's quite neat. But what makes it even cooler, and the reason that I know this is not just some photo of some dog, is that we actually have Bob's collar here. This is a dog collar that we think it's probably from like the 1890s, maybe the turn of the century. But it's this really nice hand-worked leather collar with this brass plaque on it. And the brass plaque actually says, Bob's in big black letters, 7 Oaks. So this for me is a super special object because it's telling the story of this dog, which is already unique. It's giving us his name so that we can confirm it's him based on this photo. And it's also showing us that even at the time the Inksters lived here, they called this house 7 Oaks. Today it's 7 Oaks House at 7 Oaks House Museum. But it's very neat to know that in the 19th century, people named their homes, almost like an estate you would see back in England. They didn't have street addresses necessarily, so they named the place. The Inksters called it 7 Oaks, and even today, almost 170 years later, we're calling it the same thing. I hope you enjoyed these stories. I find them kind of heartwarming, which is important because it's freezing cold in here and I'm starting to lose feeling in my fingers. But I hope you appreciated them. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you folks next week. All right, well, from my perspective, that looked like it worked properly. I hope it was smooth for everybody else too. We might change up the format a little bit for future weeks, but thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm going to try to speak extra loud now so I don't get too muffled by the mask. We will be back next Thursday at 7 o'clock. Every Thursday throughout March, we'll be back at 7. Next week, we're talking about historic clothing, which is going to be pretty awesome. The week after that, we're looking at textiles, quilts, all that kind of stuff. And then the last week is going to be my favorite. We have the master beater from all of Manitoba, Janine Crouchy, joining us. We're going to be looking at some incredibly beautiful beading, embroidery, quill work, really wonderful examples of local Indigenous art. So ending with a bang, basically. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you have any questions that we didn't answer, I'll try to get to them afterwards. You can always leave us a comment. The video will be posted after it goes live, so you can definitely tune in and share it with your friends. So thanks so much, everybody, and you have a good evening.